Hello and welcome to Hamilton, the podcast. I'm Vinton, Bayne.
And I'm Robbie, Hurlocker.
And today we're going to be going over Yorktown, the world turned upside down, and what comes next. So we've reached the Battle of Yorktown here in the musical, and this is a big, decisive battle for this whole war.
For sure.
What led us to this point? What's building up to this?
Yeah, so a lot of things have actually brought us to this point. I mean, the entire American conflict has already been going on for a little over 6 years at this point, and an interesting little detail at the surrender at the end of this battle will actually take place 6 years and 6 months to the day that fighting first started in the conflict. So a lot of things have taken us here. Some of the main players in this battle are going to be General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander who's stationed there in Yorktown. At one point, he was pursuing Washington across New Jersey earlier in this war, and he had specifically boasted to people, writing down that he would bag the American fox, talking about Washington and how he was so confident that he could take down these puny American forces and their like ridiculous leaders. And so this battle really kind of put it back to him.
Yeah, we're going to see that confidence run away quickly.
Yes, absolutely. So a few months earlier, Sir Henry Clinton, who was leading the British forces actually, had just led an attack on Charleston and had captured that particular city for the British, right? Yeah. And so he went back up to New York City with his main forces, and he left General Cornwallis in charge of Charleston specifically. And basically, Cornwallis had to hold on to that, but he got a little boastful. He decided to test his luck a little bit, and so he decided to push northward into North Carolina and Virginia, and he wanted to be able to take a lot more than just the South for the British.
Yeah, he's spreading himself a bit thin, really.
He really did, and General Nathaniel Greene, who is the American leader in this area, he was actually leading Cornwallis on a little bit of a wild goose chase a little bit.
Yeah.
Like he was staying one step ahead of him through the North Carolina campaign. They dubbed that whole campaign the Country Dance because Nathaniel Greene would kind of go ahead of Cornwallis a little bit, and then Cornwallis would go forward and kind of exhaust their troops for just a moment, and then like they'd have to spread themselves so thin that neither one of them eventually won. Greene never won, Cornwallis never won, but Cornwallis got so stretched thin that eventually he had to kind of fall back a little bit to find a place in Virginia where he could be on the ocean side to where he could actually have a port and possibly be either reinforced by Henry Clinton in New York to send down troops to help him out a little bit more, or evacuated from Virginia so that he could go up to a place where the British are actually safer. So he finds this fort at Yorktown, where it's really close to, it's at the Chesapeake Bay. You have the area around here where they can very easily be evacuated as long as Henry Clinton sends those ships and those troops to reinforce them or to evacuate them to safety.
At this point, Washington is up in New York, and he's fighting for New York City. This is what he really wants. He wants to take back New York City. They have lost New York City at this point. But they're keeping an eye out on Yorktown, and he sees this strategic opening that is left here, and he's kind of split. He wants to go down there and attack Yorktown because it's a good opening, but his heart is in New York City. He wants New York City back.
Right, and it's a little strange to have a Virginian who's so dedicated to taking New York City instead of this battle in Virginia, but he does see the strategic value of both areas, and so he goes back and forth a lot.
What was the deciding factor there? What took him to Yorktown?
Well, one of the biggest factors specifically was how there was this French fleet in the Caribbean island, in Haiti, and so it was coming up from the West Indies, escaping a hurricane season, basically, wanting to get out of the way of bad weather.
Yeah, like we mentioned last song, Lafayette was bringing over French troops, but these are different troops. These aren't the ones that he brought over with Rochambeau.
Yeah, these are additional forces that had strong ships and were going to basically only be available to Washington to use in this conflict for a matter of a couple months.
Yeah.
So these new ships were being led by Admiral de Grasse, this French leader who came up and he basically sent a letter to Washington and to Rochambeau saying, hey, is there any way that my ships can be of service in your conflict? Because you are my ally.
Why, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm like, I think we could put you to use somewhere. Initially, he says, I'm down with attacking Virginia, like taking the British settlements there. But then he's like, no. My heart is really up here in New York City. Come up here. Help us reclaim the New York City area from the British, and then with Rochambeau and Lafayette's encouragement and some of the other people there, he says, okay, back again. Let's go down to Yorktown. Let's make this work. And so there's some of that indecision that he gets attacked for later on. He goes back and forth. But when he sees that force coming up, he knows that it's a limited time resource, that he's going to have these particular ships that he can use. He tells de Grasse to basically send these ships up there to block any of the troops that Henry Clinton may be sending down to reinforce or to evacuate Cornwallis. He wants to take de Grasse's troops to basically block that off. So there's this big whole battle at Chesapeake Bay where the British Royal Navy and the French fleet from de Grasse is basically going back and forth, and there's really no clear victor. There's no like major decisive, like you destroyed all of the British troops or anything, but they held each other up for so long that it was basically a stalemate, and the forces that Henry Clinton had sent to reclaim Cornwallis's troops and help them out had to basically retreat because they weren't getting anywhere. And so if it weren't for de Grasse's troops, Yorktown would have gone very differently.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have been able to have that type of a turning point in the war.
So having decided, Washington sends Lafayette down with his troops.
Yeah, and he basically tells Lafayette to station his troops north of Yorktown to make it to where Cornwallis is unable to actually retreat northward. So that he has to rely on those ships coming into the port, or else he is up a creek without any escape whatsoever.
And at this point, Rochambeau and Washington meet up, and they decide that they're going to silently sneak down and launch their own sneaky little attack.
Yeah, and so Washington's really concerned about giving away his particular plans and his ultimate goal. And so he actually writes fake correspondence saying, okay, I'm sending these people up here. They're going to come to New York City. And he makes sure that it falls into Henry Clinton's hands so that there's a little bit of delay on their part about, well, should I send forces away from New York? Should I keep them here in New York? And Washington sends his forces down, marching in parallel lines to one another southward. So their ultimate destination was a little bit harder to determine. So he tries to conceal it. Ultimately becomes very clear that the forces are all going to rendezvous in Yorktown. You're going to have Lafayette's troops. He's leading an American battalion there. He's going to have Rochambeau's troops and the French Navy coming up, and they're all going to surround Cornwallis's 7,000 plus people who are stationed in Yorktown as a fort.
So that's a good point for us to just jump into this song. We start off seeing, as we've already stated, Battle of Yorktown, 1781. You have Lafayette and Hamilton then meeting up and discussing and kind of celebrating. They have command now.
Yeah, they've come a long way.
Lafayette's had command before, but now finally Hamilton is there, and he's excited about it.
It's what he's always wanted this whole time. And like you mentioned last week, Lafayette was actually not the one initially who convinced Washington to let Hamilton have the command here.
Right, a discrepancy in the musical and history, as we've seen before.
Yeah, but Lafayette essentially had been given permission to appoint the American leader of the battalion, the infantry that would go after the 10th Redoubt, basically. So there were these redoubts surrounding the fort of Yorktown that were basically small little encampments, small little tiny forts that were outside of the large fort, that their smaller forces were supposed to basically be able to be their last line of defense. Like if before you get to the wall of Yorktown, you're going to have to go through these things. And so there were two big ones that were held up at the end of the battle where...
Number 9 and number 10.
Yeah, numbers 9 and 10. And so Washington agreed that the French would go after number 9, and the Americans would go after number 10. And since Lafayette was leading an American troop at the time, Washington said, well, why don't you, Lafayette, appoint the person you want to lead the American force? And he puts forward the option of his own aide-de-camp, a French guy. Yeah. And Hamilton comes in, and initially he actually asks Lafayette to change his mind, to change his recommendation. But Lafayette says, hey, Washington's already approved this. The commander-in-chief's already given me a go-ahead for this. I don't want to try to change things up, don't want to ruffle things around a little bit. Hamilton appeals directly to Washington, says, hey, I have seniority. I have the right to do this. I served at your desk for a really long time when other people were given field commands. I have the right to do this. He was already on his way out of the army. Like, they'd written to his wife a lot about how this was probably going to be his exit from the military life so that he could pursue his family. He had a kid on the way, and he really did want to get back to his family, but he also wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. So he goes to Washington, says, let me have this command, and he is going to be put in charge of this light infantry battalion who goes forward and is taking out the 10th Redoubt.
But in the musical, we see that they're on the same page. They're celebrating, and they have this line, which may be one of my favorite lines in the musical: "Immigrants, we get the job done."
Yes, I love that.
And a few interesting notes about this. Lin-Manuel said that it does so well in their live performances, they had to add bars to the musical just to make time for everyone applauding and cheering
Really?
and being so excited, laughing. And
That's awesome.
It spreads it out a little bit more. And he says they've already had to add a few more bars, and they think they might have to add more in the future.
That's good. Yeah, there are a lot of times in this musical where you don't really get a lot of time to react to what's being said if you're just listening to the soundtrack specifically, because there are some really funny lines, some really emotional, powerful lines, and yeah, I could see this being a big audience favorite. We've talked a lot about different modern parallels to the American Revolution that are being highlighted in this musical. This is definitely one with immigrants who are absolutely claiming this as their own land and this American cause as the thing that they want to fight for. And so, yeah, this is something that I think really connects to a modern audience.
And if you're looking for musical connections, this line here is a nod to A Tribe Called Quest, a song they have called Jazz.
Nice. I didn't know that.
So if you like this one particular line, look up that song. You'll love that group anyways, because they're amazing.
Would I?
But
awesome.
In our current political climate, it's good to remember that our whole country was built by and defended by immigrants.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been a stigma against immigrants from the very founding of our nation either, though,
Sure.
because some of the founding fathers, like John Adams, actually had some resentment towards foreign-born American citizens versus people who grew up their entire lives in the American colonies and then joined the revolutions. There are people at the time who were hesitant to trust all of these immigrants, especially the French people who didn't really claim America as their own country, but they were just coming over and fighting for the cause, so to speak. And so, yeah, I mean, this conflict about how we should value and respect the contributions of immigrants and really cherish and love that history that we have has always been a part of the American DNA and the American struggle. And I think this musical in this particular spot does a great job of driving home how much we owe to the contribution of immigrants, and we would not be a country at all if it were not for a great, vibrant melting pot that we have become because of all the different diverse backgrounds that lead into us.
Yeah.
So at the end of their interaction, Hamilton asks the question, so what happens if we win? They're talking back and forth, Lafayette and Hamilton. He says, what happens if we win? And Lafayette answers with, I'll go back to France. I'll bring freedom to my people if I'm given the chance.
And then Hamilton says, we'll be with you when you do.
And almost every time I listen, I'm like, oh no, you liar. You're not going to be with him. Now, it is a little confusing about all of, this musical doesn't really represent all the things that happened with the French Revolution.
Right. How could it?
Exactly. This is about the American Revolution. We don't have time to talk about the incredibly messy, convoluted situation that is the French revolt and the bloody revolution over there and all the heads that are getting chopped off and everything. But yeah, in this line, Hamilton says, we'll absolutely support you. And then in the second act, you'll remember that when Thomas Jefferson is arguing to support the French Revolution.
Cabinet Battle number 2.
Yeah, Cabinet Battle number 2. Hamilton is specifically saying, you know what? We don't want to send our forces over to France because that's not a good idea.
It's interesting to see that they're actually viewing the war. They're hopeful for the ending now. They're like, okay, this is going to be a reality here. We have to think about what happens next. So it's really interesting to see that hope.
Yeah, that hope is a real thing in this moment. I think that this song gives us the kind of the midpoint reversal to this entire story, where Hamilton is going to say in a moment in a stanza, he calls back to what he said in the earlier tavern scene when he was a little bit tipsy, and he's saying, I imagine death so much it feels more like a memory. This is where it gets me, on my feet, the enemy ahead of me. If this is the end of me, at least I have a friend with me, talking about Lafayette, a weapon in my hand, a command, and my men with me. So this is what he's wanted this entire musical. He's been leading up to this. This is his goal, and it looks like he may be ready to achieve his goal, but his goal is about to change slightly based on what we saw in the last couple of songs. And he says, then I remember my Eliza's expecting me. Not only that, my Eliza's expecting, so I'm going to have a child. He says, we got to go. We got to get this job done. Got to start a new nation. Got to meet my son. So it's like his goal has been just die on a battlefield in glory for this entire musical. Now he realizes, wait, I have something to live for. I want to live for my wife. I want to start a new nation, and I want to be around to meet my child.
So both Lafayette and Hamilton now have hope for the future. And here they're parting ways, and Hamilton says, see you on the other side. And obviously this could just mean see you on the other side of the war, but it could also mean see you on the other side as in death. In history here, Hamilton and Lafayette will not see each other face to face again. They'll write letters and there'll be other things that go on in their lives, but they won't actually get to meet face to face again. And in the musical, they won't actually talk again. The next time that Hamilton talks to Diggs, who plays Lafayette, he'll be Jefferson on the other side of the argument in Cabinet Battle number 1.
Right.
On the other side politically.
Exactly. So once Hamilton and Lafayette kind of part ways, the ensemble comes on stage or starts swelling, doing their choreography, and they start shouting, I'm not throwing away my shot, not throwing away my shot. They're giving the reprise to this lyric, this mantra that's been repeated through the musical. I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot.
And Hamilton comes in with this, till the world turns upside down. And it's interesting. That's going to come back up at the end here. And when it comes up at the end, it's going to be the British forces kind of singing it in a sorrowful tone.
Yeah.
Hamilton here is singing it in a hopeful tone. The world turned upside down. Things are going to change. Things are going to be different. But it's also interesting to point out that he's saying he's not going to throw away his shot till the world turns upside down. Because if you look at him and Burr and how this musical plays out, when he throws away his shot at the end, him and Burr's philosophies have changed. The world's turned upside down. They've swapped sides.
Yeah, they've swapped philosophies for sure. Like, and that whole moment at the end when Burr is actually campaigning openly and he's promoting himself, he says, like, well, this is new. You're actually pursuing something. Like, that you're not throwing away your shot. That's new. And Burr looks at him and he says, yeah, it is. And you know what? I learned that from you.
And that's the world turned upside down in this musical.
Yes. So eventually Hamilton becomes the one who does throw away his shot and Burr advances towards it. So I love the multiple layers to these lyrics. It's very neat. So in this context, it does bring it to mind all of those things, but it specifically brings to mind the fact that the underdog is about to take down the big British Empire that has been looming over them this entire time. They're going to try to overcome this force to the best of their ability. So at that point in the lyrics, it actually takes us to that confession, that real aside where Hamilton tells us his deep, heartfelt feelings. We've already talked about it a little bit, but it is worth stating that when he went in to lead the charge with the Light Infantry Battalion against the 10th Redoubt, he specifically did write a letter to Eliza. And he knew very well that this could be his last actual correspondence with her because he's running into the battle. And so I love that there's that pause where it's in the music where someone's about to go into battle, go into a combat situation where they know it's deadly. Right. They know that it is a lethal situation with drastic consequences that are going to come out of this one way or the other. And so he sits down with Eliza, sends her a letter, and he tells her that he knows that she's pregnant with their son at this moment. And he says, I've imagined in my mind holding that child 1,000 times and holding you. And it brings me to tears just thinking about it. So that letter that he writes to her is so meaningful, so stirring and moving, knowing that that could be his last letter. Knowing now we know that it's not the last thing he sends to her, but it's so moving that he pauses before going in because it's a sober moment to go into that combat and he has to confront all of those things.
And as you'll remember, Hamilton previously wanted to die on the battlefield as a martyr. This was something he thought honorable. He wanted to fight and die on the battlefield. He was ready for that. And here he has something to live for now. I read somewhere online where someone was saying that maybe here in the narrative, it would make sense that Washington didn't give him a command when he wanted to die on the battlefield as a martyr, but he did give him command once he had something to live for. Because you want your commander to have something to live for. You want him to aim toward living through the war, not to aim for dying in glory.
Yeah, I think that in the text of this musical, that makes a lot of narrative sense. I mean, Washington specifically looked at him when in their very first meeting saying, like, dying is easy, young man, living is harder. So, Vinton, what can you tell us about that phrase that kind of just comes out of nowhere when he's done with that intimate moment of confession and he comes to this realization of what he's living for, what he's fighting for, and then he says all of a sudden to the ensemble, take your bullets out your guns.
Yeah, when I first listened to this without any knowledge of what was going on historically here, I don't think it even caught me at first. I was like, yeah, take the bullets out your guns. What does that mean? Why would you take the bullets out of your guns?
They should be in the guns so you can help.
That's not helpful. How war works. Turns out, though, that these two redoubts, number 9 and number 10, number 9, they went in fully cocked, ready to shoot.
Guns a-blazing.
Full out attack. And they lost a lot of people that way. Now, Hamilton had a different idea. He said, let's take these bullets out of our guns. Let's not allow a discharge to give away our position and give away what we're doing here. Let's sneak attack them.
Yeah.
Which is what you see in the next line. We move undercover and we move as one. And so they run in and they attack Redoubt number 10.
Yeah, and they can't let a stray gunshot give them away.
Yes.
They don't want them to realize that they're there until they're on top of the redoubt specifically.
Right. And supposedly in history, this attack on Redoubt number 10 took less than 10 minutes.
Right. And so, like, Washington had they had lined up the first parallel line. They had dug the trench facing the Yorktown fort specifically, and most of their cannons were in that area. Historically, they talk about how Washington lit the first cannon, beginning the siege on Yorktown. And here you see that they had spent most of the day attacking these redoubts, trying to tear down their fortresses and make sure there were holes for their infantrymen to jump in and try to do hand-to-hand combat in different areas. The way these redoubts were built, there were a lot of like trees and shrubberies and carved sharp branches sticking out of the particular fortification around it. Right. So a lot of the soldiers went up there with swords or with hatchets or with just their bayonets out because when they first got to the thing, they had to take their hatchets and their swords and try to knock down all of the outstanding brushes around this thing so that they could get past the sharp branches into the trenches where they'd have to jump in and fight hand-to-hand, basically, against these enemies in that area.
And I probably should have researched it a little more, but I briefly read that during this, they were trying to get into Redoubt number 10's entrance, like through the entrance, and Hamilton was like, whatever, and just dove over the wall in true Hamilton style. I'm not waiting to get into the entrance.
That's
I'm
awesome.
diving in.
I love that.
So they were using a code word during these battles, and it was Rochambeau's name. I actually read a little interesting thing from one of the soldiers at the time that he said it was a good code word because it sounded like Rush On Boys.
Yeah, I saw that in a like PBS special or something at one point. I didn't know where it came from specifically, but I had seen that one of the actors who played an American soldier was saying, you can remember what the French commander's name is, Rochambeau, because it sounds like Rush On Boys, which was the battle cry they had.
Which back then was basically the equivalent of today's Go Man Go, which is what comes up next.
Yeah.
And so the American experiment begins. And it's worth noting here that the American experiment is a phrase that we've heard used in many different places throughout history, but it was actually coined by a French author. And again, I'm not going to be able to say his name properly. Alexis de Tocqueville.
Works for me.
Democracy in America, published in 1835. And it was an attempt to figure out why democracy worked here in America when it had failed in so many other places. So it's an interesting phrase here to use at the end of this war when the country's establishing itself.
Yeah, the American experiment is beginning here. And then he talks about, my friends are all scattered to the winds. Lawrence is in South Carolina, redefining bravery, and he stands up and quotes, we'll never be free until we end slavery.
Which is Hamilton's and Lawrence thing that they have going on in the background.
Yeah,
here.
That's what unites them and holds them on. But in history, John Lawrence was actually there at the Battle of Yorktown as well. Yep. They both actually went forward and were attacking the 10th Redoubt, and Hamilton had sent him around back to make sure that none of the British forces could retreat into the fort.
And then it says they finally drive the British away. Lafayette is waiting in Chesapeake Bay. Technically, it was de Grasse in Chesapeake Bay, but it was the French.
Yeah.
And narratively here, Lafayette represents pretty much the whole French fleet to us.
Exactly. And then you bring up the next one of Hamilton's closest friends when he says, how did we know that this plan would work?
We have a spy on the inside.
That's right, Hercules Mulligan! And he comes out on stage, just owns this moment like he always does.
Yeah, on stage, when they say this, there's a bunch of the extras holding red coats over a figure, and they say Hercules Mulligan, and they throw the red coats, and Hercules Mulligan comes like bursting out of it. It's a really great moment.
That's great. A tailor spying on the British government. I take their measurements information, and then I smuggle it to my brother's revolutionary covenant. I'm running with the Sons of Liberty, and I am loving it. I love that we get this reminder of Hercules Mulligan's contributions to the war efforts here. Right. Remember, we talked about how he wasn't really a part of the combat. He wasn't really a soldier in the American forces at this time. He was leading, he owned a tailor shop in New York. And remember, New York was under British occupation.
Right.
So he was in the thick of it. He was a tailor spying on the British government from within the British-occupied New York City area. And it's worth noting, I looked around a little bit. I didn't dive into this as deeply as I should have. I couldn't find any real biographies specifically about Hercules Mulligan because he's not as large a character in American history as this musical might lead you to believe a little bit. But I did find this coffee table book that I've had for a while called Secret Heroes, Everyday Americans Who Shaped Our World by Paul Martin. And it just has one chapter about Hercules Mulligan in it, where it's just people from American history that did not get very much recognition. And he highlights a couple occasions where Mulligan was actually able to find enough information about the British movements. Like as he's measuring the troops, the soldiers, he would be asking them questions, kind of just subtly asking what's going on, where they're headed, where they're getting deported, what's going on. And then he would usher through his spy channels and through his networks, he would get a message back to George Washington and be a part of his spy network, where he, at least on 2 occasions, helped convey information that actively saved George Washington's life.
Yeah. And he actually got a lot of help from his slave Cato, who actually did a lot of the work I'd read. And a lot of times where Mulligan would be out of place in the areas where he needed to get information or sneak into, he would send Cato because no one would expect that.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we actually don't have a lot of information on them is because there's no correspondence of Mulligan or Cato that remains today, making it impossible to know everything they did for the war.
Right. And even at that time, Mulligan had basically received such a big reputation inside of the New York City area as someone who serviced the British government and the British forces there, that there were a lot of American soldiers who really hated him for his contributions to the British side. They thought he was a loyalist. They thought he was someone that had betrayed the government of America, like the American colonies, instead of someone that was actually helping them out in an active way. So after the war efforts, actually, George Washington had to go around, and he was visiting a lot of people from his spy networks, and he made this big show to help Hercules Mulligan because a lot of the colonists were attacking loyalists at the time, trying to destroy their businesses, tear them down individually, tar them and feather them, doing a lot of really sketchy things to the loyalists, and so they were attacking Hercules Mulligan.
Washington actually went and had breakfast with him visibly and publicly to show his support for him, right?
Yeah, he went there and he visited his particular house and his shop, and he went outside of the shop, in front of the shop, when everyone is gathered around, and like handed him in front of everyone a big bag of gold, saying, "Thank you so much for your efforts in the war. It could not have been done without you. I need you." So Hercules Mulligan put a big sign in the front of his shop saying, "Personal tailor to George Washington," for a little while after that. And so, yeah, he was a very valuable member of George Washington's spy networks. And Lin-Manuel Miranda does a fantastic job of writing Hercules Mulligan as a character that made me intrigued to find out more information about this guy.
Another note on the music here, you have these words being rhymed: government, loving it, shovel it. Though it's actually a rhyme scheme borrowed from an Eminem song called White America.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's another song for you to go look up and see some of the influence behind this musical.
I don't remember if I've heard that song before or not. I need to check it out.
There's an odd coincidence here, which may or may not have been intentional on Lin-Manuel's part, where he says shoveling it. That happens to be one of the feats of Hercules.
Oh, in Greek mythology, like
was
shoveling the whole river.
Yeah. And then there's a children's book from the 40s, I believe, that became really big, and a lot of people probably know it from when they were kids, called Mike Mulligan and His Steam Shovel.
Oh, I'm going to have to look that up, see if I've ever seen that before.
Yeah, so it's a weird reference to both parts of his name there.
That's kind of a nice little reference. One of the other interesting details about Hercules Mulligan's life that I did uncover a little bit about is that when Benedict Arnold betrayed the colonists' cause and he went over to the British side, which historically actually only happened a few months before the Battle of Yorktown specifically, so Washington's still very aware of how questionable his own close inner circle can be after having such a large leader in the American cause betray them to the British side. And so when Benedict Arnold went over to the side of the British, Hercules Mulligan was one of the people he named as George Washington's spy. And so he told the British forces that Hercules Mulligan was actually working for George Washington. And when he went on to trial, he was such an eloquent man. Hercules Mulligan was so articulate and so able to wiggle his way out of trouble so easily. And so many of the British people did respect him. He had been their tailor for a long time. They're like, no, not that guy.
Right,
not him. He couldn't have been the guy that was working for Washington. He's our friend.
It's a great story.
Yeah, and he got out of the court-martial, got out of the trial, was never actually accused of anything by the British. And that actually led to more American colonists thinking that he was actually on the British side, even though he was very clearly a son of liberty fighting for the colonists at this time.
So this brings us to the surrender in Yorktown. It says here in the lyrics that After a week of fighting, a young man in a red coat stands on a parapet. We lower our guns as he friendly waves a white handkerchief.
And just like that, it's over. We tend to our wounded. We count our dead.
So, in history, was it a young man waving a handkerchief?
Basically, they kind of collapsed two people in this. So what I saw is that this young man went up as a drummer. And he was
there
actually...
was a drummer boy there.
Yeah, he was a drummer boy. He goes up and he starts beating out the military code for a parley. They want to meet. They want to give them their terms of surrender. And so I actually read an account of a soldier at one point who was looking up, and it was a little cloudy and it was a little foggy, and the smoke from the cannons was clearing the field. And so for a moment, you couldn't really tell who it was that was standing up there. And so the soldier looked up and said, for one moment... For that 1 minute when this young drummer boy went up there unarmed, announcing and through his drumming beats that they wanted to parlay, he was the bravest man in the world for that minute, because he was facing all of these guns down, stepping up into a place where he would have been visibly a target, but he starts beating out the terms for parlay, and an officer comes behind him waving that white flag specifically, saying we want to negotiate a ceasefire and send some terms to one another and try to get on the same level about what we can do to end this siege.
Right. That's got to be terrifying, standing up there unarmed, just drumming out the beat to get everybody's attention while everyone's shooting and attacking in the middle of a war.
Right.
It's a terrifying place to stand.
Right. Now, I was a section leader in my drumline in high school, so I know how hardcore drummers are. Like, we're just awesome like that anyways. But no.
I'm sure in your drumline in school, you had to stand in front of a bunch of people shooting their guns near and around you.
We did have to stand in front of them during a pep rally and stuff. And not the same.
Same.
Not same.
Sure.
No.
So they would take the handkerchief that was being waved and tie it around the eyes of the person who was submitting the parley, the surrender, and then lead them in to get negotiations going.
Mm-hmm. And so the British officer was bringing in a letter from Cornwallis, and it says specifically, "To His Excellency General Washington, Sir, I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours, and that 2 officers may be appointed on each side to meet at Mr. Moore's house to settle terms for the surrender of the posts at York and Gloucester." And one of the things I really like about George Washington's response here is when he reads Cornwallis's message like that, he responds with a letter of his own saying, "Sir, I have received your favor of this morning. Regard to humanity induces me to agree to a suspension of hostility for 2 hours, that your lordship may propose the terms on which you choose to surrender." So he asked for 24 hours of time to cease the firing of these things, and Washington's like, "I will give you 2.
Yeah.
It's that's how he negotiates, from a position of strength. He knows that he has the control in this moment. He doesn't want to give them any other time for Clinton's troops to come down, for anything to change. He wants to make sure that no repairs are made on Yorktown's fortresses. He says, you have 2 hours to give me your terms, and then we are going to hopefully end this war.
So you have that line there, black and white soldiers wonder alike if this means freedom, and Washington says not yet. Obviously, this is a reference to slavery not being ended yet, and there's more freedom to be had in America than just the ending of this war.
Yeah, that's true. It also is a reference as well to the fact that even though this battle is taking place in 1781, the actual end of the revolution, the actual Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, wouldn't actually be signed for another 2 years.
Right. And even though the war ends here, there's still going to be other battles going on. And Lawrence specifically says this. He's going to die in one of those battles that happens after this negotiation is already over. But he is actually here historically in Yorktown, whereas in the musical, they already have him in South Carolina because Lin-Manuel didn't have time to necessarily write an explanation for his traveling down before touching on that later. But Lawrence is actually the one who negotiates the surrender.
Yeah, remember, he's actually the aide-de-camp to George Washington at this moment in history, and so Washington appoints him and one other representative to sit down and nail down those terms of surrender. And inside of that, like Hamilton says as in the narration, we negotiate the terms of surrender. I see George Washington smile. In the particular terms that they had, most of the things they agreed on pretty well. They agreed that they were going to allow the British officers to have basically parole almost, like once they're turning in all of their things, they would be able to go live in Great Britain and go back overseas. But for the most part, rank and file officers from the British Army were going to be prisoners of war for the next couple years until they actually reached the negotiation to make sure they could give those prisoners of war back to Great Britain. And so one of the things Cornwallis wanted to secure in those negotiations is he wanted to make sure that there was a guarantee that there would be no hostilities sought against Americans who chose to enlist with the British. And Washington absolutely refused to kind of bend over on that particular stipulation. He said, like, this is a civil matter. It'll be dealt with in the future, but they really should answer for that type of betrayal and that type of conflict and treason. And so he punts a little bit and says, we'll deal with it in the future to see what's going to happen to Americans who enlisted. But for now, we're going to capture all of your rank and file soldiers as our own prisoners.
So as a sign of the surrender, Cornwallis was supposed to deliver his sword to Washington, but he actually sends an aide to do this, which is a little bit of an insult.
Yeah.
And Washington's not going to take it, right?
Yeah, and he even more of an insult because he sends his ceremonial sword through an aide, and he originally has it presented to Rochambeau.
Oh,
like he doesn't even like represent General
French.
Like he starts to give it to them, saying like, you're the one that kind of is the biggest military leader here, so I'm going to give it to you. And then Rochambeau, in the account that I read, just shakes his head and points at Washington. And
that's great.
Washington then being insulted that Cornwallis wouldn't come forward himself, he says, well, I'm not even going to accept it myself. He sends one of his own aides to come forward and accept it for him. And you're absolutely right. One of the other things, while they're escorting the men out of Yorktown, one of the signs of an honorable surrender in this period of time is that you would be able to leave your fortress with your flag waving above you.
Right, surrendering with honors, right?
Yeah, surrendering with honor, and with your muskets are going to be bayoneted, you're going to be marching under your own flag, and just as a sign of respect for the other country that conquered them, the band would be playing a tribute to the conquering country just out of respect for them. And so Washington is asked basically, can we at least surrender with honors? Cornwallis is asking that, and his answer is, you didn't give the Charleston Americans that type of honor.
Yeah.
You treated us dishonorably. I'm not even going to remotely give you a chance to leave here gracefully. Right. You need to leave disgrace. So they leave with their flags furled up, with their flags unwaving, and with their muskets shouldered, so that they're just marching out normally with this. And their band starts just playing traditionally the legend. Like, we don't know officially what they actually played as they were leaving, but the normal tradition is that they played this old song, The World Turned Upside Down.
Right. And here in the music, another musical note. We're getting a lot of them this episode. Yeah. Lin-Manuel chose to base his rendition of this off a Mary J. Blige song called I'm Going Down. And she sings in a similar pattern, with a similar rhythm to this lyrically, when she says similar lyrics. So he kind of did an homage there to that song when he chose how they were going to do this.
Oh, neat. And we don't really know what that particular song sounded like, but if it was The World Turned Upside Down, a couple of the lyrics that I was looking up for that are if ponies rode men and if grass ate cows. Just like looking at how upside down the world is, how backwards it is. And it's a very appropriate moment for them to highlight how here the underdogs are the ones that have struck a serious defeat against the British Empire.
It's a very David versus Goliath type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here in this song, when they're singing this World Turned Upside Down, it's interesting, of course, being American, listening to it, and just narratively, you're on Hamilton's side throughout this musical. When they're singing the World Turned Upside Down, I can't help but be emotionally moved and like sorrow for them. Like this heavy emotion hits you when they're singing that World Turned Upside Down. Oh,
yeah.
Why am I singing? Don't sing.
No, I like it. Like, it sets us up for that when he says, they stagger home single file, tens of thousands of people flood the streets, their screams and church bells ringing, and as our fallen foes retreat, I hear the drinking song they're singing. These are our fallen foes who are going along. They are crestfallen right now. They are down. The thing they've been fighting for a long time themselves has just been lost, and a lot of them are now going to be prisoners. A lot of them are going to be going home embarrassed. The Prime Minister of England at the time was telling the king and was talking in Parliament at the moment, and he's basically said, oh God, we're done. This is the end. There's no way we can go on from this type of a defeat.
Yeah. But we're quickly brought back to the American side of things when Lafayette comes up and says, freedom for America, freedom for France.
Yeah, you have these victory chants now where they're like, suddenly saw the downside, the people that are downcast walking along alone, and then you see the people who are celebrating on the American side, and Hamilton shouts, we got to start a new nation, got to meet my son, we won, we won, we won, and they go through the cast, and everyone's shouting victory chants. They're excited.
Yeah. And then it almost ends again on that positive, the world turned upside down. The whole company sings the world turned upside down in a triumphant manner.
Absolutely.
Which brings us into our next song, which is the king's reaction to all of this.
Yes, the king was not very happy with losing the American colonies.
What comes next? So the first lyric here, they say the price of my war is not a price that they're willing to pay. He's talking about the British people in Parliament specifically, which you actually saw previously in Stay Alive. They were trying to hold out the war to a point where it wouldn't justify the cost anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I love that, just like the earlier song that King George came on stage to sing, he kind of frames this like a love ballad of sorts,
right,
like to a spurned lover without like unrequited love, basically. Yeah. And he says, you're cheating on me with the French.
It's like a breakup leather.
Yeah.
You've seen before that King's leathers are like creepy stalker love leathers.
Yeah.
Here you have the breakup leather.
Right. And his reaction to being broken up with, so to speak, and not being able to get the colonies back is, I'm so blue.
Which in the staging of this, if you can watch it, he stomps on the stage and they turn the light to blue on him. It's almost like I'm still commanding things. When I say blue, things are blue.
That's great. I thought that we made an arrangement when you went away. You were mine to subdue. He comes up with this big question, this probing question, like he doesn't like getting dumped. He doesn't like not being powerful enough to have all the resources to send his troops over there to take the colonies back. And so he's upset about this. And so he almost comes back with a sarcastic response to them saying, okay, fine. You want to be alone? Well, do you even know what that means? Do you know what that looks like? What comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead?
Yeah, and to go back just a little bit in the lyrics when he says, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain, the French would declare war on the British in 78 and Spain in 79, so they had a lot to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
King was not happy.
Not at all. And so France and Spain have a much more present danger for the British Empire. The colonies across the sea, it was much more expensive war for them to keep waging.
Right. But back to what you said, that what comes next argument, like, do you know how hard this is going to be for you? It's actually the same argument used by anti-abolitionists during the time as well. And moving forward, when they would talk about, we need to free the slaves, we need freedom for everyone, they would say, if we free them, they're not going to be able to fend for themselves. They're just going to die. Oh, and man, that's the same thing that King George is saying here. Okay, I'll free you, but you're going to die. You can't take care of yourself without me.
Oh, man, that's so patronizing and condescending.
Speaking of patronizing and condescending, one of the best lyrics of this whole part. Awesome. Wow.
I love
when
that.
The king adopts an American teenager type of speaking from modern day, this sarcastic voice. Awesome. Wow. Like a stubborn kid who's rebelling, basically.
Right.
It's so great.
I'm really curious to hear a recording with the new King George.
Yeah.
I don't know when you as a listener are going to be hearing this podcast, but recently, just in the last couple of weeks, they've announced that Jonathan Groff is leaving the show, leaving Hamilton to go be a part of a new Netflix series, Mindhunter. So it'll be nice to see him on that if we can.
Yeah, I'll be watching.
Yeah, absolutely. The new King George that's being cast is Rory O'Malley, who has done some fantastic work on the musical The Book of Mormon. If you've listened to that, he has some really powerful vocals. He's going to be really fun, and he's going to bring a neat little thing to this. It's sad to see Jonathan Groff go, but I'm excited to see this role continue. Yeah. So I'm interested because Groff has made this line so fun. Awesome. Wow.
Yeah. He ends it by reiterating how hard it's going to be to run your own country and saying, don't come back to me when all your people hate you, because he knows as a king that happens. And we'll find that out as a country still to this day. With president after president, there's always a large portion of the population who's very upset by the president and what he happens to be doing. We're a divided country in many aspects, and it's impossible for a leader of a country to always have everyone on his side. And it's very hard to lead. And you'll see Washington bring that up here in a future song. Winning was easy. governing is harder.
Yeah.
So he's comparing it to the war. It's harder to lead the nation than it was to win that war.
Yeah. So it's definitely the American experiment is really young. No one knows what it's going to ultimately end up like here at the time. So the stakes are high. So when you go into the next few songs, especially into the second act, they're starting a brand new nation where nothing like this American form of government has actually been successful to the degree that we want it to be at this point in history. And so King George is making a really serious point here that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. With the stakes being so high, there is going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of drama going forward. We mentioned earlier that it would be another 2 years after the Battle of Yorktown before the actual Treaty of Paris would be signed to end the American Revolution. Most Americans at that time and today do kind of just look at the Battle of Yorktown and the surrender of Cornwallis and on October 19th, 1781 as the very end of the American Revolution.
Right.
But there were a lot of really dangerous times that happened in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
So at this point in history, even though they had the victory at Yorktown, the British still held New York City. They still held Charleston. They still held Savannah and Detroit and some areas in the north as well. It was not a easy transition specifically, and the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, was still a very big force to be reckoned with. So Washington, in a letter to Virginia's governor, Thomas Nelson, he actually wrote anxiously that, and I'm quoting here, instead of exciting our exertions, the victory at Yorktown might produce such a relaxation in the persecution of the war as will prolong the calamities of it. So he actually was excited about what was happening at Yorktown, but he also thought because of this one victory, some of us might get lazy.
Yeah.
Some of the forces, the spirit of 76, so to speak, 1776, the spirit of the cause of the independence, the Declaration of Independence being there that we're fighting for, is going to wane a little bit because they're like, oh, we beat this thing, we've done this. And so the next 2 years were a scary time in American history. This particular musical collapses all of that down really simply because they don't have time to cover everything that happened in every little detail of that war. But if you're interested in more reading into what happened during that 2-year span between 1781 and 1783, there's a book that I've recently picked up that I am currently working through, written by William M. Fowler Jr. It's called American Crisis, George Washington and the Dangerous 2 Years After Yorktown, 1781 to 1783. And it's just neat to see all of the military struggles to try to make sure that their soldiers were paid, and there were rebellions because soldiers didn't have the money, the Congress couldn't pay them enough, and so they actually Washington had to stop the military from marching on Congress one time. And so it's really there are some scary moments that still were left in the war. But as far as our musical goes, we've reached the end.
Yeah.
We've reached the end of the revolution.
The last line here is by the king saying, "You're on your own." And then the staging, he throws his arms up exasperated. And that just ends it abruptly. He's, whatever, what are you going to do?
Yep.
And that's going to take us to the end of our episode.
So the next two songs we're going to highlight will end Act 1 specifically. They highlight Aaron Burr and they highlight Alexander Hamilton, and they kind of come based on the cusp of what comes after the war.
Yeah.
So they're almost answering the question that King George just posed. What comes next?
Right.
What's going to happen? Well, they're going to have some kids. They're going to have some family struggles. They're going to have to start a new nation.
Yeah.
Hamilton's going to meet his son. You're going to basically see in the next couple songs, what do they do now that the American Revolutionary War is ended? And it's going to take us into the second act where they start a new nation and you get to see everything grow up and how the American experiment turns out.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Hamilton the Podcast. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, check out @Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST. Until next time, I'm Vinton Bayne, @FleshEater on Twitter.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker @Alpha Knight. #Hamilton Podcast. It's what we do. So get on iTunes and leave us a review and let us know when you do, because we'll try to spit a rhyme or two to say we appreciate you. Although it's true, we're really not a rapping crew, but I'm sure you already know it. Like Philip Hamilton, I'm an amateur poet, but I hardly ever get to show it. So look up Hamilton the Podcast and let us know what you think. Whether you think we stink or we're all that in the kitchen sink, we value your thought, and we like you a lot. And for right now, that's all the rhyming I've got.
Yeah, so like Robbie said, if you leave us a review on iTunes, we would like to record a little something for you. So get in contact with us if you have already left us a review, or if you do leave us one here in the future. Either email us at at graphocast.com, graphocast.com, or on our Graphomania Twitter, which is at Graphocast, or on our personal Twitters, and we'll try to record something and get it sent to you.
Yeah, we'll record like a 15 to 30 second little rap for you, or rhyme or poetry thing. And Vinton, you're a bassist, so why don't you add a little bit of like a bass line underneath what I say? Let's have some fun. Okay.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.